Next time you find yourself in a supermarket, whether you've popped in for a quick lunch or you're doing your weekly shop, you might not realize it, but you're actually walking through one of the harshest testing grounds that there is for branding. Because when the choice is high and the stakes are low, weak brand thinking gets exposed in literally seconds. Now, I've spent more than 10 years working on brand and packaging for that world. And I think once you understand just what an incredibly brutal environment it is, you'll look at your own brand very differently. Before we go any further, let's just make sure we understand what we mean when we say FMCG. FMCG stands for fast moving consumer goods. Now, my background is in the food and drink area, but we're really talking about low cost items that people don't think too hard about purchasing. So if you think about it, if you buy a laptop or a car or even an expensive piece of clothing, then you might research that purchasing decision, and FMCG does not work like that. People are making very fast decisions. The stakes are low, whereas a laptop or a car, the stakes are high. The stakes are low. The worst case scenario is you buy the wrong product, you don't like the drink or the snack that you purchased, you just won't buy it again, and maybe you've lost a couple of quid. And in that environment, people are shopping on impulse. They're not thinking too hard about these purchasing decisions. And that makes the branding element, brand and packaging, all the more important. Because if your brand and packaging is not on point in that environment, you just simply will not be picked up off the shelf. And that's before we even talk about some of the practical constraints that come with working in this area too. We've already spoken a little bit about the speed of decision making, and next time you are in a supermarket, just take a step back and observe for a few minutes and watch how people navigate those choices, because it's fascinating to see, to be honest. But apart from that obvious limitation, there's loads of other constraints that you're potentially working with too. I mean, for one, your product is sat on shelf fighting for attention with direct competitors. The canvas that you're actually working with, your physical pack size might be quite small, which makes applying branding and getting your messages on there, that can be a challenge. Sometimes you're fighting limitations regarding the material, the packaging material itself. And this is particularly evident if you're printing on a film rather than on folding box board or some kind of board material. Sometimes you don't get great color reproduction, or photography doesn't reproduce that well on those substrates. There's often operational limitations that are outside of your control to do with production or factories or how things are manufactured. There's this incredible amount of limiting factors, and what it ultimately boils down to is that what you can actually say in that environment is very limited. And when what you can say is limited, what you do say has to be absolutely bang on point. So in this environment, brand clarity is not optional. It's a basic requirement. And that's the big thing that FMCG taught me about branding. In an environment with so much pressure, if you're not totally clear about why you exist, why someone should choose you over the competition, what makes your product or service different, then you will not get picked up off the shelf. And in this environment, that looks like being delisted and a competitor taking your place. I've literally watched products die a death on shelf because of a lack of clarity. And even if your product or service is never on a supermarket shelf, you can still apply these same principles to your website or your Instagram feed or any advertising that you might be engaged in. And when I first started working in this environment, I found it incredibly restricting. And it took me a while to realize that actually, rather than allow these limitations to dictate the outcome and put shackles on. With a little bit of creative thinking and smart brand strategy, these very same constraints can be leveraged and turned to our advantage. Now, if you are enjoying this content, please do hit that like button. It lets me know that this is resonating with you and to make more videos like this one. And if you do want to see more from me, please also consider subscribing. Now, if you think about it, what a constrained environment forces you to do, by definition, is make more decisions. And that's a good thing, because decisions are where brand strategy actually lives. You can no longer start saying, well, my product is for everyone, because for everyone is the same as being for no one. So maybe you pick a product attribute which you know might alienate some people, and you lean into that, because if it alienates some people, then it will probably resonate strongly with another group of people. So once I realized to stop thinking of these constraints as limitations and to really start working with them, they started to provide a real framework for branding-based decisions. Now, this first example is not actually from the world of branding, so you'll have to forgive me the slight tangent, but I do think it's super relevant to the conversation that we're having. Now, I recently watched Christopher Nolan's first feature-length film, Following. Now, this was a film which he created just after finishing university. He made it with literally no budget at all. He's using friends as the actors and borrowed resources from UCL. And it's fascinating hearing him talk about that film later on, and talking about how almost every creative decision in that film was informed by constraints and limitations. You know, they chose to shoot the film in black and white. And while, yes, that is a stylistic choice, it was also a practical one, because controlling color with absolutely no budget was really challenging, and black and white allowed them to simplify the lighting, but it did allow them to also lean into this very deliberate film noir aesthetic. And if you think about it, that's no different to maybe choosing to limit the number of colors you're going to use on a print job, maybe to 2 or 3 colors, because you know the limitations of the substrate that you've got to print on, and you know it doesn't reproduce maybe photography that well. And then maybe that leads you down a creative route where you end up with a graphic, bold, creative execution, which then becomes synonymous with your brand. And he talks about dozens of small little choices like this that they had to make whilst making that film. But I think the one thing that really stuck with me is hearing him talk about how some of those techniques that they were forced to use back then, because they were so constrained, actually became useful later on in his career when he was shooting The Dark Knight and shooting on IMAX cameras with just a monumental budget. So in other words, those limitations didn't restrict creativity, but they informed the creative direction. And to bring things back to the world of branding, you only have to look at how, you know, Guinness took a potential product limitation in that it's a slow pour drink and flipped that on its head and built a brand around that idea with good things come to those who wait. I mean, it's genius. And I think that's the takeaway here, is that no matter what kind of brand you're trying to build, you'll almost always be working under some form of constraint, whether that's time-based, budgetary, operational. And the mistake I see a lot of brands make is that they try and pretend that those constraints or those limitations don't exist. You know, I've seen big brands present themselves as being small boutique brands, I've seen small brands try and present themselves as much bigger, and it's not surprising that both end up feeling slightly inauthentic and confused. But I think the best brands are the ones who engage with constraints and limitations deliberately and honestly. Because the very thing that might just make your brand unique might actually be hiding inside those limitations. And if you want to delve a little bit deeper into what a brand actually is and why it's so much more than just a logo, then do check out the video on the screen now.